just want to support Stanley's point there about Bob Rauschenberg and the way he worked. We spent a lot of time together at night because Bob worked at night. Quite often he didn't get up till 4:30 in the afternoon. So he didn't get into the studio until 5:30 or 6. And then he would work till midnight and then take a break and eat dinner. And then we would continue to work until we saw the sun come up usually. I mean, that's just the way he worked. But I once said to him, we'd taken a break and we were going to have dinner. And it was about 11:30, 12 o'clock at night. And I said, how do you know? How do you start a new piece? And he said, well, there's this guy Rauschenberg, and he goes over to the studio and he starts looking around for something to do, and I just sort of guide him to pick up stuff and look at it, and we start something together. And that's literally the way he works. He was always inspired by the events that were happening around him. And, you know, we made quite a few projects together. When I first came to him, or came to New York, talk about green, I was really green. I had just come from graduate school at the University of Minnesota. I'd spent 2 years in the US Army, and I'd been working in a commercial print shop. I'd been printing as a printer or working in etching and litho since 1963. And I got drafted in 1967. I went to the military, and then while I was in the military, they put me to running a commercial offset print shop. So I was playing around with photography and doing all that kind of stuff in this commercial print shop. And I was sending letters back to my professor of lithography at the University of Minnesota, where I was a graduate student. I'm saying, I'm doing all this photo stuff. We've got to figure out some way to do something with it. Well, he tells Mrs. Grossman this, and the moment I'm out of the Army in 1969, I'm going to New York to do photosensitive lithographic stones with Bob Rauschenberg. Now, how that got translated into photosensitive stones, I don't know to this day, but that's what I ended up doing. Bob showed up with 12 dogs. The door opens to this limousine. You can't see in it. The door opens, and all of a sudden there's a constant stream of dogs jumping out of the car. Finally he gets out, and it's like, you know, I'm a 25-year-old, 26-year-old artist at that time, and Bob Rauschenberg is like God somewhere walking around, and I'm about to meet him, so it's kind of a scary moment and a wonderful moment at the same time. But there was this wonderful idea of these stones being sensitized with some sort of magic photo emulsion. Jim and I had the right idea because Ken was kind of this, well, I'd say mechanical engineer, and he liked everything engineered. Am I right about that? Yeah. So everything was aircraft specifications. So ULA didn't have that because Tanya Grossman didn't know anything about printing. The technique of printing wasn't interesting to her. What was interesting was the image and what the artist was doing. So, you know, most photo emulsion is light sensitive. So what do you do in a studio that doesn't have a dark room? You wait till it gets dark, and then you go outside. So Bob and I were out in the front yard putting this photo emulsion on the stones. Now, I think Stanley will agree that this kind of stuff Bob Rauschenberg just loves. If it's something that's not supposed to work, and there was a period of this time of about 2 weeks, which it did work, and we never got it to work again, that we worked with Bob doing this.
You might tell him no accident.
That's exactly. Well, prior to this, he had had some experience. The old press at ULAE had needed a new bed put on it. And in those days, the knowledge about printing lithographs, 1963, 64, wasn't so extensive as it is now. So there were a lot of problems that came about simply people not understanding what to do. So this big stone was put on the bed of the press, and as it was going through the press, it broke. And Bob simply said, we're just going to print it like that. He just took the moment. What were you supposed to do? You were supposed to throw it away. But instead, he made a print that won a grand award in the biennium, it would be on in 1965. The pieces turned out to be a hallmark piece, like Booster has for ULAE, you know, that sort of thing. But this is the way Bob works. He tries to use what happens to him in his everyday life. Those two pieces on the wall hanging back there called Veils came about with a similar idea. Tanya had this handkerchief that she tied around her neck. And it was 1 o'clock in the morning, we just finished dinner, we were going back to the dark room, which I set up by this time, that's 1973. We had a little dark room. So we were dropping this handkerchief on the printing plate and exposing it with light. So we were just pitching it up and letting it fall. That's the result of those two pieces there. But that's just the way Bob was working. Just that kind of invention. And until the day that he passed away, that's the way we worked together. Bringing some idea that that I thought would give him the chance to think beyond where he was at. And then he would take that idea and give me back something that would give me the chance to think in a way that I hadn't thought before.
He also said, when you get good at something, move on to something else. That's the time to learn about the new things that you're not good at. And whether he would go roller skating or do a million other things in his life. His theory of how he would function with the world was so incredible. I was certainly one of the lucky ones, and Bill was too, who were able to be around Bob Rauschenberg and be privileged to see how he functioned, how he thought, and to a genius. So that part happened, and just by being around him, by being in his environment, he was this incredibly open, generous, brilliant person who, you know, you wonder where all of it comes from, but who knows. But I always heard that he had dyslexia, which I have no doubt about, because he just looked at the world in a different way, and he just absorbed what was around him. And if you were fortunate enough to be one of the people to be around him, or situations around him, you became part of it. And he loved people, he loved the television being on, he loved information coming in, and then he used it in what was meaningful to him. So when you saw all this happening, it was just like you were in awe constantly about how the man functioned. And we were lucky enough to start with him in '67, and he was probably, you hesitate to say things about the most important, because it's like, who are you going to pick out of your children? But I have very little hesitancy of picking up Bob Rauschenberg as the most brilliant artist I'd ever been around. Part of it was because of the way he used his environment and the way his openness to everything. And we started in '67. I spent 5 weeks with him in China. And in 1982, we went to an old 1,000-year-old paper mill in a very remote part of China. So seeing him functioning during those times, I lived at Captiva for a while, when we were doing a series called Public Arms. So saw him function on that level, and this constantly, you know, the guy who would come into a place and cut me off if I talked too long, because you could talk about any one of these things for 3 days. But he was someone that would always come in saying, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what I'm going to do. And the first thing he did at Gemini happened to be Booster, which I think was certainly as important, if not the most important print that Jim and I ever did. It was Mungo print. So it started on that level, and what did he say? He'd always kind of wander around and absorb his environment, and then he would decide by the second or third day, by the third or fourth or 20th time he was there, you knew that's how he functioned. So he didn't worry as much about when he said, I don't know what I'm going to do. So he said, well, I've always wanted to do my self-portrait, and I wanted to do a x-ray of myself as the basis of the self-portrait. So my partner, Sid Felsen, knew this guy who, a friend of his, who was a radiologist, I think, who did x-rays, and he took him there to have this done, and they had to do it in 3 parts, which Bob loved, because he loved things that have many parts to them. And then x-rays were not quite as efficient at that time, and he said, you can't take another x-ray for close to a year, because you absorbed enough of that you shouldn't take any more. And it started that way, and then went on where we were walking, and he reached down and saw this crumpled up little kid's drawing, and it was a rocket booster. So, okay, he called it Booster and Studies. So he would just, whatever happens in life, that's what happened. And it was totally incredible to always be able to be around that. So
We had the opportunity of working on a chapel with Renzo piano in southern Italy. It was a chapel that the Catholic Church had commissioned Renzo to do. And inside, in the chapel, was a space that was 150 feet wide and 50 feet tall. And Renzo called Bob, and he said, I want you to make a painting for that space. So he explained the story. On the outside, there was going to be a seated area, and on the inside, there would be a seated area. And there would be panels on the inside of the windows that would be raised, and the people on the outside could see this painting on the outside. But then on the other side, you wanted to see it like a stained glass. So we had to find a material that light could be both passed through and then could be opaque. Well, I'd done a couple of projects for the Merce Cunningham Dance Company for Bob, for backdrops. And I was working with a company called Garrett's International, which has a big printing operation in Kassel, Germany. And they had this product which they used for the Paris Opera. And it was a kind of plastic that if you looked at it on one side, it was opaque. But if you held it up to the light on the other side, you could see through it. So we began to develop an idea. So trying to figure out how to manage this thing was a crazy deal. But Bob created a work. And the work was 8 feet tall. And it was proportioned the width that when I blew it up to the size that it was supposed to be. Because the whole idea was the way we would do this is we would set it up with a computer-based program in which there would be 8 feet by 8 feet of these windows with a section printed on it that could roll up and down like a window shade. Bob created this work. I printed out this digital thing that was about the size of this table, and we flew to Rome to meet with the Pope because we were going to show this to the Pope. We went in the back of the Vatican. I had my big tube under my arm, and Bob had his image of the piece. And we went in and we laid it out on this table in the back of a library, the Vatican's library. And this cardinal shows up, and he says, the Pope can't come today, but I'm supposed to look at it with him. They had given Bob the book of Revelations to study. Now, Bob, I don't know if you know this about Bob, but Bob was almost a preacher. He knew the Bible backwards and forwards. I mean, the guy was amazing. And he came this close to being a religious fanatic, I'm just telling you. Absolutely, he was I'm a Calvary Baptist guy from Lindsay, Oklahoma, and he was worse than me when that sort of stuff. But he knew the Bible backwards and forwards, and nobody was fooling around with him on that one. So he picked out some passages from Revelations, and he very carefully orchestrated this painting because the top of it was oval. And he very carefully orchestrated from left to right what he wanted to see happen. And in the center, where the oval was the biggest, was this big satellite dish right in the middle. Because where's God? He's in space. And so we're going to get these signals down from him through this satellite dish. So there's this piece lying on the table. This cardinal walks in. Renzo shakes his hand, comes over. Renzo's there with his son. We look at the piece. Renzo's crazy about the painting. It's a fabulous piece. It's now at the Mendiel Museum in Houston, Texas. He comes over, and the cardinal looks at it, and he said, "There's no Madonna here." And Bob said, "Well, I thought when God speaks, we have thee." Well, Renzo grabbed Bob and said, "Bob, we need to go in the other room and talk for a second." The cardinal leaves. That's it. So we go out, and Renzo says, "Bob, go back. Put a Madonna over in the corner, and everything will be okay." Now, at this point, I've worked with Bob for about 25 years. I know there's no Madonna ever going to get in that painting. No way. But we go back to the room, we have a drink, we talk about it. I call my wife, who's an Italian. I'm married to an Italian. She was raised as a Catholic. She says, "Put Bob on the phone." So, when I got married, Bob was my best man. We had the wedding, the pre-wedding night dinner was in his place in New York City. Our honeymoon was spent down in his fish house in the bay. So, my wife and he talked quite often. So my wife says to him, "Bob, here's what we do. You come back to New York. We get a couple of nice-looking girls, maybe a couple of nice-looking men, and we have a party down at the studio, and we invite this cardinal. We have some champagne, and I'm sure that we can get this through." We fly back to New York. He flies down to Florida. This is a Friday night. I call him on Saturday morning. Well, not Saturday morning for Bob. It's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He says, "Well, I'm working on it. I'm thinking about it." Sunday night, he calls me and he said, "You got a fax machine?" He faxes a letter that he's written. I own a photocopy of it. I framed it. My wife and I framed it because the integrity that it shows. Just to paraphrase one part of it, he says, "Either my God or your God." My God is a sympathetic God. He doesn't preach fire or brimstone or any of that. He's sympathetic. He supports people. He helps people. And I'm either too religious or not religious enough, but I don't feel qualified to do this project. And he withdrew the painting rather than change the painting. That's the way he was about his work. He simply didn't change. Now that painting is on exhibit. It's still the way it was. But as Stanley will tell you, he didn't change his work. Once it was done, he just moved on to the next print. And he did something else with it. Because everyone had its own life. And he said more than once to me, "How would I know if I'd done a major work or not?"
You mentioned Rocky. Well, where does he choose where he decides to go around the world to do his projects, to places he wants to go? He picked out whether it was Cuba, whether it was Chile, whether it was Russia, wherever it was, the place he wanted to go. So, again, the way the man thinks. Another thing that triggered with Booster because at that time he said, well, what's the largest paper we could get? And again, the largest paper around everyone's 22 by 30. If it was big, it was 30 by 40. And so Arsh's, I think it was, said to us, we said, what's the largest paper you can do? He said, well, you know, we make it on a roll. We can sell you the whole roll, and then you decide. The width is predetermined, but the length can be anything. So, but Bob triggers those sort of questions that always came up. Materials came up. I mentioned about materials, about how Bob used them. Well, there he is in China, and he's doing these collages, and he's deciding what he's going to put on them. For one thing, he wanted only things that came from China. He didn't care what it was as long as it came from China. It could be ribbons from there, books about tractors, exercise books, anything came from China. But he felt that they would understand it better if it came from there. I'm not sure they did because farming is what they were into mostly, but just the thought of that. So he's trying to think of one day what to do, and he has this scarf that Simone Forti, the dancer, had given him. So he pulls the scarf out of his, wherever he was carrying with him. He said, let's cut this apart. I'll put pieces of that scarf in some of the collages. I mean, he opened up permission for other artists to use anything. You don't want your hand to show, you don't have your hand show. I mean, he made all these paintings, these transfer things early and calm lines, and you never felt an artist painting something in it. I mean, it's just, which was not an accident. And here there were these beautiful paintings, but he'd always stretch everything. But the use of materials, he gave permission that photography was one thing and fine art was another thing. Bullshit, you know, he'd just mix them all together and he'd use the photography in it, and it wasn't an issue. He'd use materials in it, the scarf he was carrying with him wasn't an issue. The issue was, did it turn him on, and it didn't mean something to him as to what he's trying to say, and did that make his work more meaningful? And it sure did. He didn't seem like he wanted to talk about the past very much. It was always about right now. He lived in the moment.
Past was uninteresting.
Uninteresting. And so, in the moment, and it's very hard for all of us to learn that lesson. This is what's real right now. And he knew it every moment of his life. That was the moment he was in. And he showed you why and what. He also said something brilliant when he was living on Front Street, which was by the fish market. I think he and Jasper were living down there in Manhattan. And he said, you know, everything I could possibly want and need in this world is within a block of here. I mean, who thinks that way? It's all here. Don't go searching out everywhere. It's okay if you do it, nothing wrong with that. You don't have to do it that way. I mean, it's all here. Just do what's around you. Do what's here. And, or you'd say to God, well, you find all these special things. You said, no, I find the average thing, the regular thing, what's around. We went around. A good example is that when he came out and did L.A. Uncovered, where he did his observations of Los Angeles. And so you had all kinds of observations of Los Angeles. You had the David Hockney, and they're all valid observations. It's the West Side swimming pools and the wealthier people and the world that many of us knew a lot about. Bob wanted to see all parts of LA. We had to hire through Joe Wax, a off-duty policeman, to go with him. Yeah, it was expensive. And he was going through pretty rough places. And that's what he loved, and he made it beautiful. It was beautiful in South Central. It was beautiful in Royal Heights. It was beautiful everywhere he was. Bel Air Hotel he went to, the Swans were beautiful. So, I mean, it's just the way he thought. Everything. So, you can't help but be pretty affected by someone that's allowing you into their life that thinks about the world that way. use what's around. Use what talks to you. I don't think he'd ever tell you to use a material. It would never be that. It'll be, you're the artist. He had a great respect for his profession. And he would get pissed off if someone didn't respect the profession. They're in a profession that he's in and that he feels is the best one there is, and respect it. If you're going to be in it, respect it. And that was the main thing, bring that respect to your art. It comes through anyway, the truth comes through, and he tried to guide himself and then other people to that spot, and I think he did it very effectively, that tradition, because that tradition will always be there, I think.
It takes a lot of courage to be yourself. And I think that Bob's goal always was to be honest to himself, to be himself. And whatever idea that he had was his. And he really passed that on to me. It's why it's so hard for me to accept a lot of things, because I see people attempting to be what they think other people want them to be. And the one thing Bob never was is he is an inspiration to us to be ourselves. He was never what somebody else thought he should be. Even the Pope couldn't get him to be somebody else.
He loved the story when he was talking to de Kooning and maybe erasing a drawing or something, and he said to de Kooning, doesn't it bother you that all these people around, there's de Koonings all over the place and everyone's doing them? Doesn't that bother you, son? He said, they can't do the bad ones. Part changed and part didn't. He used his own photographs because we used a photograph in a series called Hoarfrost, and the artist sued him. Scared the crap out of him because he always would take transfer photographs from mostly European magazines, and he said, from now on I take my own photographs, because he felt very comfortable always doing that.
He was shooting images of copper mines and metal mines, because South America is very rich in metals and materials. He started something called Rocky back in the 80s, and I think it came out a lot out. It really gelled for him in 1982 when he went with Stanley and Jim and I over to work in the paper mill in China, of how important it would be to do that exhibition. But one of the points, Cuba and Venezuela and Chile and China and Tibet and Germany and all these, Russia and all these countries were 9 countries he traveled in total. But he was out photographing when he was in Chile, and he photographed, I guess, what the military thought was some sensitive areas, and he was thrown in jail actually, and spent some time, 2 or 3 nights in jail. But what he took away from it was, when he came back to the United States, he bought big sheets of copper, brass, and aluminum, and he started working on it. He found a material, because of that association, with a new idea about his paintings. He worked like that a lot. And I must say, he took a lot of inspiration out of printmaking. A lot of his life came out of printmaking. One of the biggest, I guess one of the announcements that kind of excited Mrs. Grossman in the early formation of Bob's life was, Leo called her one day and said, Tanya, you've got to talk to Bob. He's using silk screens on his paintings.
That was low life.
He can't do that. Well, he did do it. And that kind of inspiration led him into a lot of different avenues. Later in his life, in the early 90s, he began to use the iris printer, which was one of the first actually efficient digital printers that one can use. We were all aware of it, but the problem with the iris is it used a fugitive dye, because the heads of the printing heads were so fine that you couldn't get a pigment through it, or they didn't manufacture pigment small enough that you could get through it to color it, so you couldn't put any sort of light fast control over it. But Bob was determined that he was going to use it. And we had finished, as part of the Rocky project, Jim and I did a series of beautiful woven cloth images for the Russian part of the Rocky project. We finished a set of 7 large etchings called the Soviet American Array. And we had used a particular paper that I had found that was being made at that time, a T.A. Saunders paper, watercolor paper. It wasn't even a printing paper, it was a watercolor paper. So when he decided to go with this idea of working on these prints from the Iris printer, he called me and he said, what's that paper we use for that? Can you send me a couple of rolls? So I sent him a couple of rolls. And he started making these water transfers from these dye transfers called waterworks. And this was 89, 90, something like that. And he began to construct these paintings. And well, to make these paintings, work, in order to protect them so that the light didn't bother them, he ordered Lexan, UV protected Lexan on big rolls. Did you see those rolls that he had in Florida? I mean, he had these monstrous rolls that he would roll off, and he made these metal frames. He set up for fabrication. He had wood made for mats, like bevel cut, beautiful bevel cut mats. Anagrams and waterworks came with this paper. Because when you work on that paper, water affects paper no matter what you do. And so the paper was crawling all over the place. And a sheet the sheets came 60 inches wide, and as long as you want to roll them off on a roll. So he was making 60 by 120, images. He had these big tables in his studio when he was doing these transfers from the Iris printer. And this was great because he could photograph things with his camera. He carried around with a Canon with him. He shot shots everywhere. When he went with Stanley, I think he took a Don Sapp film. Don provided him with a 2 1/4 Hasselblad. But he took these images and scanned them all into a big bank that he had, a reserve bank, of digital files. And he started outputting them and transferring them onto these papers. Now, this was excellent for him because we used to have a running joke around the studio. At one point, he didn't want any evidence of his hand in the work, just the photographic image. And you can see that on the walls over there. There's a couple of pieces over there, that have no sense of any handwork on them because he didn't want it. And so, we would say, Bob, why don't you put your hand print, why don't you do a brush stroke or do something? We were trying to get him really to just do some sort of work by hand to show the audience that he was present. So it got to be a joke with him. You want me to put my foot in it too? Well, that was the way it was. But what the point I wanted to make was that he quite often pulled out of this world of working at Gemini and ULAE and Graphic Studio ways that he used in his paintings. And I don't think anyone would disagree with this statement. If you're an artist and you know your work well, you will make good prints. But if you don't know yourself very well, you will never succeed in making great prints because it takes a lot of concentration and understanding about yourself personally to really dig those images out in printmaking and do something with them. And for one to spill back into the work, what the printmaking did for you is also another level of thinking. It's almost Zen the way that happens because who knows what a creative thought really is or an action that's taken that leads you to the next one. I said to Bob once, how do you know when the next painting is ready? How do you know when something's finished or you're going to start something else? And he said, I always know when I'm going to start something else when I see the next painting ready to make.